The Evil Within is a third-person survival horror game that follows Sebastian Castellanos as he and his two partners seemingly slip into a nightmare after responding to a crisis at a hospital. The game is available on PC and PlayStation and Xbox consoles. Atmosphere. The Evil Within resides in its unique state of an ever-changing and evolving nightmare, with the environments morphing around you as if they're being rewritten on the spot. Some places are put together in an almost deliberate video game way to exist as a brutally unforgiving gauntlet for the player to navigate, whilst other places are realistic, vast, dark forests, dilapidated hospitals, moody, expansive mansions, and tombs and temples of unknown design. There's an electric feeling as you explore some of these environments, and the dreamlike feeling hangs in the air, with each new area changing the undertones from menacing to surreal. It can be a little confusing and disorientating, but that's exactly the point. Many characters vanish on purpose and reappear later, and the lack of consistency is there to rob the player of any kind of ground in which to get used to.
It's much more loud.
You heard something just now?
Though this does mean it's not too difficult to become desensitized to it. As the game keeps on shifting and changing, it can feel that holding on to what's happening can be futile, since in a short while, something else will come along to replace it. There are some chapters that feel less intense than others because of the constant changing, with some taking place in broad daylight and others in dark, dank crypts. It's an unavoidable side effect of the way it's done. There are plenty of moments where the tension rises to an unbearable level as the player is forced to navigate traps and enemies that deal quite a large amount of damage if they catch you. The game does heavily encourage stealth, and lurking around attempting to stealth kill enemies really raises the tension quite high, but even regular combat can be nerve-wracking, as engaging with the various enemies with limited ammunition has you checking that you don't waste any unnecessary shots. The game can be very stressful, especially in its combat scenarios, but even walking around the game's many different areas, there's an apprehension that it's about to change, a constant feeling that the rug is about to be pulled out from underneath you for a surprise you aren't ready for. The Evil Within's atmosphere varies heavily, from moments of serenity and peace as a rendition of Claire de Lune leaks out of a cracked mirror that feels as soft and welcoming as the safe rooms in Resident Evil, whilst also presenting hellish environments that epitomize evil, even to a fault sometimes. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's combat stands head and shoulders above everything else most of the time, with stealth leading to plenty of startling moments, whether it's being suddenly caught by an enemy or setting off one of the game's many traps. There's lots of sometimes inadvertently frightening moments because of the gameplay and how enemies react to you. But there were a lot of times where the combat went on for too long or was frustrating due to the high enemy damage and random elements of the game. Combat was generally less frightening in the daytime areas, and some scenarios felt so artificial that they came across as more of a chore. It's a very delicate balance that the game repeatedly struggles to maintain. The enemy designs were sometimes fascinating and others a little generic. Some of them managed to invoke an immediate revulsion due to the way they moved or appeared, which made killing them either satisfying or harrowing. There's a few scripted events that are unsettling, with the game using a lot of misdirection to mess with the player, which is a constant theme, and it works both for and against the game. On the other hand, there are some scripted events that felt overblown, with the game camera and screen effects putting a large emphasis on something very small for quite a long time. Sebastian's animations linger for a little too long in some cases, which just felt awkward. There were chase sequences that were a little too obviously scripted, and whilst they were fairly exciting, there wasn't much of a feeling of fear, as it seemed like there should have been because of how on rails it felt, even if it wasn't the case. The scares are very inconsistent because the game itself is very inconsistent. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. Whilst Claire de Lune is the most obvious standout track, it's supported by a great deal of atmospheric winding drones and groans, sinister dark ambient tracks that reflect the areas that the game presents. The chase music is a little less inspiring and a little bland, and it does make the chase sequences a little less interesting as a result. The sound effects are extremely well done, especially when combined with the game's excellent reverb. The sounds of heads exploding is a little over the top, but it's not unwelcome. The guns, and especially the grenades, sound fantastic and overly powerful, and even melee weapons like the axes are very satisfying to use thanks to the way they sound. Unfortunately, the voice acting on a lot of the characters leaves them feeling emotionless to things that are going on around them, with Sebastian himself feeling the least expressive. Other characters like the Doctor and Ruvik fare better, with more interesting dialogue in general.
Who's there? No, don't shoot! I'm not one of them. I'm a doctor, Marcelo Jimenez.
You were in the ambulance before it crashed, right?
Yes, we're lucky to be alive.
Have you seen anyone else?
My patient Leslie. I saw him running up ahead, but...
But?
Come this way. Quietly, mind you.
As mentioned earlier, the game has some really great reverb for spacious indoor areas, and it really helps the immersion with the music subtly playing underneath the sounds of the game. There's directional audio as usual, and it's implemented just fine. The sound design is pretty great, especially for the combat, and aside from the voice acting, it's generally very good. That's 2 Harry Masons.
Good lord.
There are too many to shoot our way through.
One of us could try to lure them away while the other gets the gate open. You're the one with the gun.
Gore. There's a ton of gore, from giant vats of blood to enemies being stood on and bursting underfoot in sickening squelches. Shooting enemies leads to bloody explosions that never really get old as the game goes on. It sticks to the player and stains the walls around them. The stuff that's part of the environment is very dark and realistic, and it appears a lot in many locations throughout the game. It's difficult to say whether blood is overused, since it's nearly everywhere and used in most environments when not sprayed on when the player's killing something. It's used in puzzles, and there's a lot of scientific diagrams that require either brain surgery or something more barbaric. Gore is really used in nearly every aspect of the game. It does feel excessive, but it never really feels out of place. That's 3 Harry Masons.
What is going on here?
Story. Sebastian Castellanos is a detective working for KCPD alongside his partner Joseph and Kidman, who arrive at a hospital after receiving a call. Finding the place a total massacre, Sebastian checks a monitor and witnesses an unknown being seemingly breaking reality, and is suddenly confronted by the being before waking up in a bloody basement. The game's plot is pretty weak throughout most of the game, with only small parts of the backstory really flooding in now and then, with notes explaining science experiments that fill up a lot of the early game. It's overwhelmingly obvious that what's happening to them isn't real, but they can't find their way out of what is happening to them. The later game is much better for feeding the player backstory as the tale becomes more personal, with the game's antagonist appearing more in flashbacks, which later come to explain the scenarios the players experience. The characters themselves are a bit bland, with many of them lacking in emotion thanks to the voice acting and dialogue, which makes the few times they're all together feel like not much of anything. The story is a little weak, but considering the game's setup, where the characters are meant to be as oblivious to what's happening as the player, it's unsurprising that this is the case. The story does eventually catch up in the later stages of the game, but it would have been nice to have the more substantial things happen earlier. Making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. The Evil Within is a game that I personally don't like at all, and it is very easily my least favourite horror game, but it doesn't mean that I can't see its merits even if I don't appreciate them myself. The Evil Within will always be a controversial game to me, and whilst I hope not to play it again, I get the feeling it will be cropping up again in the future. This is the last time that I'll be remaking a review. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I felt like I was trapped in the inner recesses, I did not lose my mind and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.